All right, let's find out now what happens should parties fail to strike deals on possible coalitions. Our commentator, Angelo Fick, joins us now via Skype. Angelo, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Now, which are the hung councils? You know, we're all talking about Johannesburg, Tshwane and Nelson Mandela Bay. Where else?
Well, there are a score of other municipalities in smaller places, particularly in those places in Limpopo and the Northwest Province where no outright majority was taken. And the ANC would presumably, with the majority share, have to either negotiate a should we say, coalition, or they have to decide to go ahead if a coalition can't be formed with a minority government. One of the most interesting places I think that is going to happen is that space that I think has haunted South Africans since 2012, Rustenburg, which is the city closest to Marikana, where the economic freedom fighters got quite a substantial share of the voters in those spaces where there were mining hostels. And the African National Congress also lost some of its own votes to a split off from its own party. That is a division dedicated to service delivery. And so it's going to be outside of the main metros as well, where people have to begin to think very critically about what strategic alliances parties are forming and how this will impact on citizens' right to municipal governance, as Des van Rooyen has pointed out.
Well, you know, everybody's talking about coalitions. Tell us why coalitions are necessary for the parties. And I think on the back of that as well, what happens in a situation where, you know, parties just can't agree, really?
Well, firstly, if there's no outright majority winner, nobody gets 50+1. You have to try and find those who got smaller shares of the votes to form that majority so that you can form the government and fill all those posts that Des van Rooyen outlined in the bite that we just played before this. That's obviously the easiest route after no majority was achieved. And so in Nelson Mandela Bay, the Democratic Alliance will try and get some of the EFF votes and some of the other smaller parties who have seats in the municipal chamber to come on board and form what they call a coalition government. In that coalition negotiation, there might be negotiation around individual posts, shall we say. You know, that one party might want the economic portfolio, another one might want to have the portfolio on local infrastructure issues. But the economic freedom fighters have indicated that they're not particularly interested in posts. What they want are principles. And that's often where a lot of other coalitions are also formed in the world, where parties agree beforehand which issues are going to become issues that one party needs to let go of its position and accommodate the other party and find a midway. Local economic development is going to be a very crucial issue because all parties are promised jobs. But the way in which they want to assure that citizens in municipalities get those jobs are very different. And so those ways will have to come to some sort of compromise. And that's, I think, going to be very much part of what over the next 14 days the smaller parties are going to negotiate for, because they've made promises to the people who voted for them, which they also have to deliver on.
Well, take us through, sorry to cut you off there, but take us through what happens if and when these coalitions are secured. What's next?
Well, once they're secured, presumably then the council meeting is called. There is an election for the mayoral, the deputy mayoral, and the various portfolios that are there. Depending on the structure of the municipality, that might mean a mayoral committee, or it might just mean an executive mayor. Once that process is underway, we will have to see political party members come together on various issues to agree on how to vote on bylaw proposals or whether to propose certain kinds of changes. So this is not a wholesale, you simply flush everybody who was there before out. You still have to abide by the law. There is a municipal governance act. There are public finance management acts. There are various pieces of legislation that you have to abide by. So there isn't going to be this radical change where tomorrow you wake up in a municipality that used to be governed by the African National Congress, and now it's governed by the Democratic Alliance and its coalition partners, and suddenly everything changes. Change will have to happen slowly because we have the Labour Relations Act that protects municipal employees. We have the Public Finance Management Act, which means you can't just rescind agreements that are in place. You have to go via the legal process and you have to go via the chamber. And presumably some of the people who are now out of government and in opposition will not so easily let go of the plans that were put in place. And there are contracts with private companies, there are contracts with people who won the tenders that you cannot simply, withdraw and move on from. So political party differences aside, after these 14 days are up, government has to proceed inside the legal and policy framework, regardless of which party or parties now govern that municipality. And, the change that I see, that I think people are looking forward to, will happen over the 6 months to a year, in which it'll take municipalities all sorts of meetings to come out of existing agreements legally and begin to start new agreements as legally. This isn't just you can stop everything that has happened before and start on page one all over again. Citizens can be guaranteed that they should have the same level of service and that those improvements that they've been promised should happen over the next 6 months. There isn't going to be a radical change where everything suddenly changes in the city or the town the very next day.
Angelo, there is a perception that, the smaller parties right now, you'll have a lot of power. But how much power do these smaller parties actually have? And what do they, in essence, really get out of these coalitions with the bigger parties? It does seem that the bigger parties are the ones who would gain more from this, I suppose, forced relationship.
Well, this is a race for power. So the bigger parties are obviously trying to court, shall we say, the smaller parties to side with them. So if there are two large parties at 42 and 41%, or 43 and 38%, the difference that gets them over 50 is going to be, the business of the other 12 or 7% of parties left. And I think what smaller parties will get out of this is precisely those electoral promises that they made their constituents, the people who voted for them, the people who are members of their party. And some of those are very significant things. They have to do with the ability to build mosques in certain areas, deregulating certain kinds of policies around, water supply, changing the mechanisms around, all sorts of agreements and policies. So those smaller parties now have an opportunity to get on paper an agreement from the majority parties, what it is that they're willing to do for this party in order to get them to form a coalition with them. And it's those kinds of what is traditionally called horse trading that I think people forget, that it's not just about the possessions of, do you get to be finance manager? Do you get to appoint the director of sports and recreation for the municipality? But actually, what are the issues on the ground that matter to the people that voted for you, that you can now argue, even though you didn't win the election, the majority party that wants your support as a small party has to begin to think about and has to agree to implement those measures that you feel. And that's the kind of horse trading on policy issues, on priorities that I think are going to become issues where bigger parties have to compromise on whatever they've decided to do and accommodate smaller parties who in this way have, I think, more leverage because they can walk away. And then what you have is a big party that can't form a majority government. It must form a minority government, which is a lot harder to sort of operate in a municipal chamber.
Angelo, you talk about accommodating smaller parties, and I think it's important to ask, can parties with such different policies, especially on land, economics, and can really work together, especially when you look at what we're hearing about the DA and EFF possibly getting into bed together? And is there a possibility that the EFF would have to take back their earlier statement where they said, we will never get into bed with the ANC? Could they then have to swallow their pride and say, okay, we'll have to maybe consider that?
Well, politics is made up of very strange alliances, and nothing would surprise me. I mean, we've all seen letters between provincial heads of one party sent to the office of another party, where you would have thought these people have nothing in common. One group of people, when the ANC letter circulated on social media, its legitimacy was questionable or questioned by many. But its letter to the Freedom Front Plus, it took many of us by surprise. But it really shouldn't, because if it's a race for power, as we saw in the coalitions formed in the Western Cape in the early 2000s, really it is what it is that the majority or the bigger party is willing to give up. And how do they stand by principles that they've agreed with their electorate to do? Because if they don't, the short-term gain of being in the municipal chamber in power might actually end up with long-term losses for a substantial number of people who say, well, if you're willing to compromise on some very specific principles of non-racism, of issues of land, of issues of affirmative action, of issues of black economic empowerment, next election we simply won't vote for you. And those are, I think, crucial issues that voters remember. This election has taught South Africans more than any other one before it, that voters actually do have a memory, and they do look around them, and they do ask very critical questions of what was done for them, and are willing to take a chance of, even if they don't vote for one opposition party that is the major alternative, they will vote for some other party in order to signal to the party that used to hold power, in this case the African National Congress, that they're unhappy with what has been done. And sometimes that isn't even just a municipal issue. It can often be an issue inside the party, or it can be an issue inside the country more generally, or the province. There are all sorts of political dynamics, and voters' behavior is never simple. It's always complex and complicated. And parties, I think, have this time learned that you can't betray voters in a way that does not have consequences later. If you promise people X, Y, and Z and you don't deliver, at some point they actually shift their focus and decide to vote somewhere else.
Angelo, just in closing, and I know you've mentioned that nothing would surprise you, when it comes to politics. Well, having said that, what should we be watching for in the next few days and I suppose weeks?
Well, one of the things to constantly ask all parties who enter coalitions is, what have they given up? What are the agreements? What are the principles? Because the Constitution guarantees that we should have open and fair and transparent municipal governance. And we cannot have agreements that are secret between parties, because after all, they made sets of promises to potential voters in the lead up to the election. Going back on those promises is in essence betraying those who voted for them. Because if you said that you were going to put black land first, or you were going to put economic development first, and now in order to get power, you compromise on that particular principle and say, well, we're now going to focus very much on financial management of the municipality, because that's what the majority party that we are in coalition with wants. That actually is a betrayal of what you told your voters, and people who voted for you have every right to then take you on, because you can't, it's a standard pattern across the world. But really, citizens ought to hold those they voted for to account, because if the race for power and therefore the race for resources overrides the principles in politics, then we sit with the situation we sit with now, which is no party can gain an outright majority because there's such a level of distrust in the voters that they can't just switch from one to the other. And I think the fact that so many of these councils are hung tells us something about where we are in South African politics, that voters aren't clear what the solutions are, even though they're very clear on what the problems are.
Angelo, great insight as always. Thank you very much for that. We thank you. That's eNCA commentator Angelo Fick.